Yeah, Minister, how are you feeling after the passing of your former colleague, Nikki Kay?
It's incredibly sad. I knew Nikki well, obviously, as a colleague and a friend, and it's just really tragic news. So yeah, I don't have much more to add. It's obviously fundamentally a private event for her and her family. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. What is your announcement today for community housing providers going to mean for low-income New Zealanders?
We want the community housing sector in New Zealand to grow and expand. Groups like the Salvation Army, Ōtautahi Community Housing Trust, Emerge, they play a great job around the country in building social houses for people in need and looking after people in need. So my message is that the government doesn't have to do social housing by itself through Kāinga Ora, that the community housing sector has a real role to play. So what we've announced today is a series of short-term changes to make it easier for the community housing sector to access debt so that they can go and expand and build more houses. And we've also announced that we're looking at a credit enhancement tool to make it easier for CHPs to borrow in the longer term, and that I think will make a real difference. Where we want to get to is a system of neutrality between Kāinga Ora and the community housing sector. It actually doesn't really matter who builds the houses as long as they get built. Kāinga Ora is going to play a really important role as part of that, but so is the community housing sector.
Yeah, does the government plan to increase income-related rent above 25%?
It's not our focus. We're looking at ways to improve the way in which we deliver housing funding. The system of housing funding at the moment is expensive, duplicative, often very opaque. You've got a whole series of different housing programs that have built up over previous governments, including the last government. And so we're having a really good look at those, and no decisions have been made. And once we've analysed all of those things through the lens of value for money, but also how do we get more houses built to house people in need, we'll make announcements about that.
Minister, how are you going to ensure that you're still meeting all of New Zealanders' housing needs throughout the region and throughout the country?
Well, there are differing housing needs in every region. So, for example, we know that there are some parts of New Zealand that have real housing need where people are in emergency housing. Rotorua is the most obvious example of that, that I think most people are aware of, but Hamilton is another example where you've got real housing need, a lot of people living in motels. The good news is the government's done a lot when it comes to emergency housing already. We've seen a 70% reduction in the number of families living in emergency housing, and 1,600 kids have moved out of social housing in just 1 year alone, which I'm really, really proud of. So what we're aiming to do is set up a pipeline of building activity around the country for both social housing and affordable housing, so that we can address all of those needs in different regional locations. And different regions have different needs, and there are different players in every region. So the community housing sector that the conference we're at today is very diverse, and the Ōtautahi Community Housing Trust, for example, is a Canterbury-based, Christchurch-based community housing provider. The Dwell Housing Trust is a Wellington-based provider. The Salvation Army is a more national provider. So there's depends where you are, and depends on the particular need, and it depends on the capability of the community housing sector. And so there's no one size fits all. It's about embracing all of the community sector and its diversity, and making sure we can fund them to build the houses that we need.
Are you satisfied with the job Kāinga Ora has done providing community housing?
We commissioned an independent review into Kāinga Ora soon after coming into government, which was very critical of the fiscal sustainability of the organisation. Essentially said it was financially unsustainable without real changes. And so we have a new board in place, and the first thing we did from them was ask for a reset plan or a turnaround plan. Ministers have now received that turnaround plan, and we are now going through that, and once we've considered it and made decisions based on that plan, we'll make those announcements. But our absolute aim is to get Kāinga Ora back to financial sustainability, drive down the cost of construction of new Kāinga Ora houses, to make sure that we can build as many of them as possible within the funding envelope that's there, and look after people in need.
Yeah, do you have a timeline for that, as well as the changes that are announced for community housing providers?
In terms of the changes for community housing providers, the operating supplement changes, which is providing upfront equity for the community housing sector to enable them to borrow at better terms that will come into effect in the new year. The contractual changes will be working through by the officials now, and again will come into effect early in the new year. And some of the work around strategic leasing and looking at leasing options, that's probably midway through next year. In terms of the credit enhancement work that we're looking at, we've asked for a report back early in the new year, and for ministers to make policy decisions based on that. It's quite complicated, so I'm not trying to over-promise on that, but what's clear is that we're committed to exploring the variety of options that there are around credit enhancement to make it easier for CHPs to borrow, so that they can lower their cost of finance, lower their cost of borrowing, and lower their cost of delivery for new social housing places, so that we can get those homes built.
And your funding partners, when do you plan to announce those?
So the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development is in the process of signing contracts right now, more smaller scale developments, a few housing developments here and there. These strategic partnerships that we're looking at with the larger, more established community housing providers, that is Q1 next year.
So, Minister, there's a bit of a conversation in there about momentum and a bit of dispute on how much momentum there actually is ongoing. How do you plan on focusing on Kāinga Ora community housing and also emergency housing? How do you plan to balance that?
Well, one of the points I made in my speech is that everything in housing is connected to each other. So if you fundamentally look at it, the reason why we have people living in emergency housing is that there isn't enough social housing and there isn't enough private market housing for people to live in, and rents are too high. So when rents are too high, people end up on the social housing wait list, and when they're on the wait list and there's not enough social housing to go around, they end up in emergency housing. So the fundamental way to address all of the above is to build more houses across the continuum. In particular, when it comes to emergency housing, moving people into social housing and affordable rentals is a really important part of the mix. So the Priority 1 program that we campaigned on and implemented in April this year says that if you're in an emergency house and you've been there for quite some period of time and you have children, that is no state that anyone wants to fund. That is a disaster for you, your family, and it's a disaster for taxpayers, and it's a disaster for society. So Priority 1 says if you've got kids in emergency housing and you've been there for quite a long time, you go to the top of the wait list. And over the last few months, we have been aggressively moving people from emergency housing into social housing and then putting wraparound support around them to make sure that they can maintain that tenancy. Those houses are delivered both by Kāinga Ora and also by the community housing sector, and there is real momentum in the community housing sector, and there is more money available. In Budget 2024, we just funded the community housing sector to build more social houses while we dealt with the Kāinga Ora turnaround plan and made sure that we were getting that organisation financially shipshape again. So 1,500 new homes, $140 million in Budget 2024 funding, reprioritised funding from the First Home Grant. So we took low value expenditure and moved it into high value expenditure, and that funding is starting to be contracted and starting to flow now.
Minister, in your view, do you think the South Island or the North Island is more in need of affordable housing?
Well, it would depend. It depends on the particular location and the particular rental profile of particular towns. So one of the things I've said to the officials, and this is part of the slightly new approach when it comes to allocating where the social housing goes, I've said to them, you've got to have an absolute focus on the areas where the need is the most, and I think taxpayers would expect us to focus on areas where there is real housing need, and so those decisions are operational decisions made by people other than me for good reason, but we've given them the tools and the metrics to assess housing need, and an obvious one that they are looking at is where there is a lot of emergency housing, because to my answer before, one obvious thing to do is to move people out of emergency housing into social housing, but to get the social housing to be there for people to move into, you've got to build it and contract it in the first place. So that's why I say there's a bit of a nexus between emergency housing and social housing. But the most important thing is to fix the fundamentals of our housing market so that rents are lower over time anyway, and so that people don't end up on the wait list in the first place, that they can afford an affordable rental in the first place, so they don't have to go on the housing wait list. And that goes to the fundamental drivers of our housing reforms.
One question for you.
Yep.
Your announcement today is designed to get houses built faster. What impact do you expect that to have on house prices?
Well, the community housing sector plays an important role at the social and affordable end of the housing spectrum. Today's announcement is not really about lowering house prices. I've said publicly we want house prices to be lower over time, and that goes to the point I made before around dealing with the root causes of our housing crisis, which is land supply, infrastructure funding and financing, and making sure that councils are incentivised to go for growth. That is the ultimate long-term answer. Is it just actually a question of supply and demand? And so we're very focused on those fundamental policy settings that we're working through and making announcements right now. But even if we solve all of that, there will always be a role for the government and the community housing sector to provide low-cost, affordable housing for people in need. There will always be a role for the government to do that, and there will always be a role for the community sector, and there will always be a role for the government to fund the community sector to deliver those houses. And so today's announcement is about getting the social housing system, which is a subset of the wider housing system, in as good a shape